given the slightest of reasons. Despite her lack of formal education, Matilda continues growing her intelligence, with the help of books that she receives from her neighbor and close friend, Mrs. Phelps. In her free time, Matilda goes to Mrs. Phelps and spends time talking to her and telling her different stories. One day, two teachers from a nearby school visit the Wormwood residence to inspect if the children are being educated properly. Although Matilda's parents lie and claim that their daughter is being homeschooled, the observant Miss Honey senses something amiss and decides to talk to Matilda in person. While the parents are busy with the other teacher, Honey secretly approaches Matilda and tells her about the perks of studying in school. To lure her, she also offers to teach Matilda literature if she agrees to attend school. Though hesitant due to her parents' disapproval, Matilda eventually accepts the proposal and walks back to her room. After the teacher leaves, Mr. Wormwood confronts her and not following his plan. He then punishes her by enrolling her at Cruncham Hall, an infamous school led by the dreadful headmistress, Agatha Trunchbull. Listening to this, Matilda comes up with a strategy to exact revenge on her father for his mistreatment. When her parents are enjoying watching TV programs, she secretly enters their room and pours the permanent hair color into her father's hair oil bottle. Later, when Mr. Wormwood applies the oil, he's shocked to see his hair changing color. He then immediately rushes to Matilda's room and returns after finding her deep in sleep. But in reality, Matilda can be seen smiling as her father closes the door. The next morning, Matilda wakes up early and rushes to her school, excited to attend class for the first time. To her bad luck, she arrives in front of the school so early that even the gate is not open. Right then, Phelps arrives there and informs Matilda that she's about 1 hour early to school and offers the little girl to spend some time in her library. Matilda agrees and follows Phelps to the library. There, Matilda begins telling a story about a famous escapologist and his lover, an acrobat. She mentions that both of them were experts in their areas and well-respected. Matilda's book-loving friend, Mrs. Phelps, is intrigued by the tale and inquires where she had heard it. To her surprise, the little girl proudly states that she constructed the story. She then resumes the story and tells that the boy and girl get married but fail to bear a child even after years of being together. In front of a large audience at a circus, the couple announces that they'll be performing a daring stunt called The Burning Woman, where the wife with dynamite in her hair will be hurled through the air over sharks and spiky objects, only to be caught by her husband locked in a cage. Mrs. Phelps is intrigued by the story, but Matilda admits that she doesn't know what happens next and needs time to think and add to it. Before Matilda can complete the story, the school gate opens and she enters the school with another new girl. As soon as they walk through the gate, they witness a statue of Mrs. Trunchbull, the vicious headmistress of the school. The girls are told by other students that the school is like a prison and that no one can escape from Mrs. Trunchbull's wrath. The headmistress is known for beating and straightening out the students before they graduate, making the school a place of fear and misery. After a long wait, a woman who loves working with children. Unlike the infamous Mrs. Trunchbull, Miss Honey is a breath of fresh air for Matilda, and she feels relieved to be in her class. Following this, Matilda takes a look at the class board and notices that it's filled with algebraic equations that the seniors had written the previous night. Miss Honey then asks Matilda to clean the board, but instead of using a duster, Matilda starts solving the equations. To Miss Honey's surprise, Matilda is able to solve all the equations correctly, leaving her in complete awe. Miss Honey becomes curious about Matilda's talents, and after the class is over, she decides to speak to the headmistress about the little girl's incredible IQ at an early age. In the next scene, when Mrs. Honey enters the headmistress's office, we're shown the first glimpse of Mrs. Trunchbull, a giant woman who wears an army uniform even at school. Her room is filled with trophies that showcase her talent as a hammer thrower. Miss Honey nervously approaches Mrs. Trunchbull and tells her about Matilda, but as expected, Mrs. Trunchbull is not interested. She has no desire to give any student special attention and is only interested in punishing and making their lives miserable. Later that day, when Matilda returns home, she excitedly shares the details of her first day at school with her parents. However, her parents, particularly Mr. Wormwood, a car salesman, is too preoccupied with his recent sale of illegally modified luxury cars to pay any attention to their daughter's achievements. Despite the illegal work, Mrs. Wormwood is happy due to the money her husband is making. However, Matilda, who values honesty, scolds her father for cheating others. In response, her father rips apart her book, leaving Matilda heartbroken. Seeking revenge, Matilda sneaks into her parents' room the next morning and pours glue into her father's hat. He unknowingly puts on the hat and heads off to work. The following day, Matilda makes new friends at school, but her happiness is short-lived. A boy rushes in, panic-stricken, and asks for help. The reason for his fear is that someone has poured syrup on Mrs. Trunchbull's chair, and now she's convinced that the boy is responsible. He also mentions that the punishment for such an offense is severe. The guilty student will be placed in Chokey, a punishment box where they're tortured like hell. Despite the fear that grips the students, Matilda remains calm and quickly comes up with a plan. She instructs the boy to lie down and then asks everyone to cover him with their coats. As they do so, he becomes completely hidden from view. Later, when Mrs. Trunchbull arrives on the scene, she's determined to find the culprit and demands to know who's responsible. In reply, Matilda points to the pile of coats and claims that the boy had collapsed from exhaustion about 30 minutes ago. Mrs. Trunchbull is furious that she cannot punish the boy now, and decides to take her anger out on an innocent girl with ponytails. She seizes the girl by her hair and swings her around like a hammer ball, launching her outside the school premises. The other students watch in horror as this unfolds. Fortunately, the girl is not hurt and she returns to school as if nothing happened. After school, Matilda meets Mrs. Phelps and continues with her story about the escapologist and his pregnant wife. She mentions that the acrobat hired a cruel and menacing manager, who's also a former hammer-throwing champion, to help with the show's promotion. However, during the performance, the escapologist finds out about his wife's pregnancy and tells the same thing to the crowd, canceling the show. This initially stuns the crowd, but they eventually understand the situation and erupt in applause. However, the arrogant manager interrupts the emotional moment, explaining that the show must go on because she has spent a lot of money on promotions, and even threatens to call the police if the couple don't perform. Having no other options left, the escapologist and the acrobat reluctantly prepare themselves for the dangerous stunt. Before the story completes, Matilda again leaves, not before informing Phelps that she will continue the story the following day. The next day during lunch in the school cafeteria, Mrs. Trunchbull accuses someone of stealing her chocolate cake. Right then, a small but overweight boy burps loudly and is caught by Mrs. Trunchbull. Mrs. Trunchbull then orders him to eat a large chocolate cake entirely, or else he will be sent to Chokey. Despite the odds, the boy eats the entire cake with the encouragement of his friends. Mrs. Trunchbull is surprised by the turn of events and tries to find an excuse to punish the boy. However, she ultimately takes him to the Chokey, even though Matilda tries her best to stop her. After school, Matilda visits Mrs. Phelps and tells her the remainder of the story. She mentions that the escapologist and the acrobat successfully execute their stunt. But at last, his pregnant wife falls and sustains several fractures. She dies shortly after giving birth to their daughter, leaving the escapologist to raise her alone. With an aim to give his daughter the best life, the escapologist then hires the evil manager, who is also the stepsister of his late wife. Unfortunately, the stepsister torments and forces the little girl to work. One day, the escapologist finds out about it and promises the little girl that he will take revenge on the cruel stepsister. Sadly, he leaves at night in his car and never comes back. Back to the present, Matilda is alone in her room when she discovers that she can move objects without touching them, using telekinesis. The next day at school, Mrs. Trunchbull declares that the day's physical education classes will take place on a field with barbed wires, high fences, and mines. She also mentions that the students must cross the entire thing without rest. Matilda is horrified by the cruelty and decides to take action. She asks her female friend to drop her pet newt into Mrs. Trunchbull's water glass. As she planned, when the headmistress sees the newt, she becomes enraged and tries to punish all the students. But Matilda stands up to her and calls her a bully. She also uses her telekinesis powers and chases her away from the field. After school, Matilda shows off her newfound powers of telekinesis to Miss Honey, who is surprised but promises to keep it a secret. As they walk home together, they bond over their hobbies and interests, and Miss Honey invites Matilda to her small cottage-like house in the forest. Matilda asks about Miss Honey's parents and discovers that she was left in the care of her cruel step-aunt after her mother passed away and her father disappeared. Listening to this, Matilda has a sudden realization that the story she was narrating to Mrs. Phelps about the escapologist and the acrobat is, in fact, a real story about Miss Honey's parents. After Miss Honey confirms it and reveals that her step-aunt is none other than the cruel headmistress, Matilda becomes even more determined to seek revenge against Mrs. Trunchbull and retrieve Miss Honey's stolen home. However, when Matilda arrives home, her parents give her bad news. Mr. Wormwood informs Matilda that the faulty cars he sold have been discovered, and that the customers are now after them. He then asks her to pack her belongings, as the entire family is now moving to Spain. This news comes as a setback to Matilda's plan, but she remains determined to help Miss Honey and defeat the cruel headmistress. The following day, despite being saddened by the news that her family is moving to Spain, Matilda decides to attend school one last time. At school, Mrs. Trunchbull summons all the students to a dark room for a spelling competition and announces a harsh punishment if any of them make errors. She then reveals a choky box with razor-sharp thorns in it. The competition starts well, but when students start answering all of the words, Mrs. Trunchbull brings up a fake long word. When a student fails to answer, she drags her to the choky box. Seeing this, the other students start purposely giving wrong answers, thinking Mrs. Trunchbull cannot punish them all at once. But to their horror, Mrs. Trunchbull has multiple choky boxes set up and reveals them all. Matilda then decides to take matters into her own hands and warns Mrs. Trunchbull to go away. When Mrs. Trunchbull doesn't listen, Matilda uses her newfound power, creates a large humanoid figure out of metal chains, and destroys all the choky boxes, leaving Mrs. Trunchbull stunned. Following this, she binds Mrs. Trunchbull through the ceiling. Afraid, Mrs. Trunchbull then leaves the school and house keys and flees the place. After saving her fellow students from the wrath of Mrs. Trunchbull, Matilda receives their gratitude but has to bid them farewell as her parents come to take her away to Spain. Mr. Wormwood also yells at Matilda and tells her that they're getting late for their flight. However, in the meantime, Miss Honey intervenes and requests Mr. Wormwood to let her take care of Matilda. Surprisingly, after some initial hesitation, he agrees to it. Matilda then says a proper goodbye to her parents and even removes the glued hat from her father's head. Later, Matilda and Miss Honey reach their new home, in which the latter's parents, the escapologist and the acrobat, once lived. The movie ends on a happy note, with them both starting a new life together, leaving behind their unhappy past.